The throne room was vast and silent. The only sound the faint rustle of Silvara's torn robes as she knelt on the shimmering floor. The light from the twin moons outside filtered through the arched windows, casting long, sharp shadows. Her once brilliant skin, glowing like the heart of a star, was dim now, dulled by shame and exhaustion. Around her, the advisors stood in rigid silence, their cold eyes fixed on her like judges pronouncing a sentence. On the obsidian dais at the far end of the room, King Vardock sat in his massive throne, the metallic edges of his crown gleaming under the moonlight. His expression was carved from stone, unreadable, but his eyes burned with cold fury as he gazed down at her. He leaned forward, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "I have given you every chance, Silvara," he said, each word deliberate, heavy with judgment. "Years of patience, years of waiting for you to fulfill your duty as queen. Yet, here you kneel, empty-handed." Silvara lifted her head slowly, her eyes wet with unshed tears. Her voice trembled. "My king, my husband, I have tried. I have sought healers across the stars, endured rituals, consumed potions from the ancients. Please, Enough!" Vardock's fist slammed against the armrest of his throne, the sound reverberating through the chamber. Silvara flinched, her words cut short. His piercing gaze bore into her. The Juran Empire does not wait. It does not forgive failure, and it does not tolerate weakness. She clutched at the hem of her robes, her fingers trembling. "I have stood by your side through wars, through chaos. I have been your partner, your queen, your shield. Please, Vardock, I can still serve." He rose from his throne, his towering figure casting a long shadow that seemed to engulf her. "Your loyalty means nothing if you cannot fulfill the one duty that matters, providing an heir. You are a relic of the past, Silvara, a reminder of what the Empire must leave behind." Silvara's breath hitched, panic blooming in her chest. She looked up at him, her glow flickering faintly. No, you can't do this. I am your queen." Vardock's voice was low, cold. "You were my queen." He turned to the guards flanking the room. "Take her away." Two guards stepped forward, their polished armor glinting in the moonlight. They grabbed Silvara by her arms, their grip firm and unyielding. She struggled, her voice breaking as she fought to free herself. "Vardock!" she screamed, her tears now glowing as they streamed down her cheeks. "Don't do this. Please. I gave you everything. I loved you." Vardock didn't even look at her. He turned his back, his cloak trailing behind him as he walked back toward the throne. His voice was calm, indifferent. "You gave me nothing." Silvara's cries echoed through the chamber as the guards dragged her toward the massive doors. She kicked and twisted in their grip, her voice raw with desperation. "You can't do this. I am your queen. I will not be forgotten, Vardock." The heavy doors slammed shut behind her, her voice muffled as it faded into silence. Vardock stood still for a moment, staring out at the twin moons. He did not look back. Silvara sat motionless in the cramped transport ship, her glowing tears leaving faint streaks on her dim skin. Outside the small viewport, the glittering palace grew smaller, shrinking into the distance as the barren wasteland around it stretched endlessly. The engines hummed quietly, the only sound in the suffocating silence. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, her breath fogging it faintly. Her hands curled into fists on her lap, trembling. The weight of her exile pressed down on her like a shroud. But deep inside, something sparked, a faint, flickering ember of defiance. He thought she was finished. He thought he could cast her aside like a broken relic, forgotten and powerless. But as Silvara stared out into the darkness, her dim glow began to brighten ever so slightly. Quietly, she whispered to herself, "The stars burn brighter for those who fight, and I will fight." The transport ship disappeared into the void, carrying her away from the only home she had ever known. But in her heart, She knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning. Silvara's transport ship landed with a dull thud on a barren, rocky world. The air outside was dense, tinted with faint hues of orange and brown. The land stretched endlessly, dry and lifeless, save for jagged rock formations that jutted from the earth like broken bones. This wasteland was to be her prison, a forgotten corner of the Giron Empire, where exiles were sent to fade into obscurity. She stepped out of the ship slowly, the harsh winds tugging at her ragged robes. The once majestic glow of her skin had dimmed further, her body aching with the weight of her humiliation. The ship's engines roared back to life behind her, and before she could turn to look, it shot into the sky, leaving her alone. The oppressive silence that followed was deafening. Silvara collapsed onto her knees, the desolation around her echoing the emptiness she felt inside. Her hands dug into the dry, cracked earth as her tears fell silently. The wind howled, as if mocking her pain, and for the first time in her life, she felt small, insignificant. Days turned into weeks. Silvara wandered the wasteland, surviving on what little vegetation she could find, drinking from shallow, bitter-tasting water pools that barely quenched her thirst. Her strength waned with each passing day. Her once proud figure hunched as despair took root in her soul. She spoke to no one. There was no one. The silence was absolute, save for the constant drone of the wind. But then, one night, everything changed. Silvara was huddled beneath a rocky outcrop, the cold biting through her tattered robes. Her body was weak, her glow barely visible. She had begun to drift into a restless sleep when a faint, rhythmic sound reached her ears, something unnatural. It was faint at first, like the tapping of metal on stone, but it grew louder, closer. Her eyes snapped open and she froze. No one was supposed to be here. She was alone. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her body trembling as she pressed herself against the rock, her glowing eyes scanning the darkness. The sound continued, a metallic scraping that sent a chill down her spine. And then she saw it, a figure silhouetted against the dim light of the moons. It moved cautiously, scanning the ground with some kind of device that hummed softly. The figure was smaller than a Giron, its shape unfamiliar. Silvara's heart pounded in her chest as she crept closer, her breath catching in her throat. The figure was unlike anything she had ever seen. It had no glow, no shimmering skin or elegant stature. Instead, its body was covered in strange, bulky material, armor or clothing of some kind. And then she saw its face. Its bare skin was smooth and pale, with two sharp eyes that scanned the ground with an intensity that unnerved her. It was a human. Silvara had heard of their kind, primitive, violent creatures from a distant world. Stories of their ingenuity and resilience were whispered in Giron courts, often tinged with both fascination and disdain. But what was one doing here, in the middle of nowhere? The human suddenly stopped, turning its head sharply in her direction. Silvara froze, holding her breath, but it was too late. The human had seen her. "Who's there?" the human called out, its voice sharp, tinged with an unfamiliar accent. It gripped a metal rod in its hand, raising it defensively as it stepped closer. Silvara stepped out from the shadows, her weak, flickering glow illuminating her gaunt figure. The human's eyes widened, and it lowered the rod slightly, its expression shifting from alarm to curiosity. "Wait, you're not from here," the human said, its voice softer now, almost disbelieving. "What are you?" Silvara's voice was hoarse, her throat dry from weeks of silence. "I am no one." The human tilted its head, frowning. "No one? That's hard to believe. You're glowing." Silvara took a step back, wary. "What are you doing here? This is a world of exile. You shouldn't be here." The human chuckled, a sound that caught her off guard. "Funny. I could say the same to you." It gestured to its gear. "I'm Daniel, biologist. My ship crashed here a few weeks ago. Been scavenging ever since. Didn't think I'd run into anyone else, let alone someone like you." Silvara hesitated, unsure of what to make of this strange creature. His demeanor was unlike anything she had expected. Casual, almost warm. "You're human," she said flatly, her tone tinged with suspicion. Daniel nodded, smiling faintly. "That's right. And you're?" He gestured toward her with a questioning look. She hesitated, then answered quietly. "Silvara. I was a queen." Her voice faltered as she spoke the words, the weight of her fall pressing down on her again. Daniel's brows furrowed, and he lowered his rod completely. "A queen? What are you doing out here?" She turned her gaze away, her glow dimming further. "I failed. I couldn't give the king what he wanted. He cast me out." For a moment, Daniel said nothing, his expression thoughtful. Then he took a cautious step closer, his voice soft. "Sounds like he didn't deserve you." Silvara's head snapped back toward him, her glowing eyes narrowing. What would a human know of such things? "Maybe not much," Daniel admitted, shrugging. "But I know what it's like to feel like you're nothing, like you've been thrown away." He glanced down at the cracked earth beneath them. "I've been stranded here for weeks, thinking I'd die alone. And now here you are." Silvara stared at him, her suspicion warring with the faintest flicker of hope. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't alone. The thought unsettled her, but it also gave her a reason to keep going. She straightened slightly, her glow brightening just a bit. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "we can help each other." Daniel smiled. "I think we just might." And in the desolation of the wasteland, an unlikely alliance was born. Silvara sat quietly by the flickering campfire Daniel had constructed, her glowing skin reflecting the orange light in faint ripples. The chill of the wasteland night pressed in around them, but the warmth of the fire offered a rare comfort. She watched as Daniel rummaged through a makeshift bag, pulling out small tools, metal scraps, and vials of strange liquids. His movements were precise, deliberate, a stark contrast to the chaotic emptiness of the world around them. "You said your people are advanced," Daniel said, his voice breaking the silence. He didn't look up as he continued working. "But you couldn't solve infertility? That doesn't add up." Silvara bristled slightly at the question. "It is not a question of science," she replied, her tone defensive. "It is a question of purity. My kind believes that tamper with our essence, our DNA, is sacrilege. The king would never allow it." Daniel raised an eyebrow, glancing at her briefly. "Right. And because of that, he exiled you." Silvara's jaw tightened, and she turned her gaze toward the fire. "He needed an heir to secure his power. I could not give him one, so he cast me aside." Daniel leaned back, sighing as he wiped his hands on his shirt. "Sounds like the problem wasn't you. It was him. Your body isn't broken, Silvara. Your system's just misunderstood." Silvara frowned, her luminescent eyes narrowing. "And what do you know of my kind system, human? Your people are primitive compared to the Zirans." Daniel smirked, his tone calm but laced with a quiet confidence. "Primitive, huh? Funny, because humans solved infertility centuries ago. Gene therapy, cloning, stem cell engineering, you name it. We cracked the code. And I think I can help you." Silvara stiffened, her glow flickering faintly. "You would presume to interfere with my body, to tamper with what even my people would not dare." Daniel shrugged. "I'm not saying it'll be easy. I'm saying it's possible. You're not the first being to face this problem, Silvara. The only difference is your people refuse to try." Her gaze remained fixed on him, her mind racing. The thought of allowing this human to experiment on her was unthinkable, a violation of everything she had been taught to believe. And yet, there was a spark of curiosity, a fragile thread of hope that refused to die. "What are you proposing?" she asked, her voice hesitant but steady. Daniel leaned forward, holding up a small vial filled with a faintly glowing liquid. "Your DNA is designed to function in one very specific way. But if I can synthesize a genetic catalyst, using your biological material and a little bit of human ingenuity, we might be able to activate dormant traits in your system." Silvara's expression darkened. You would mix your DNA with mine? Not exactly, Daniel said quickly. Think of it like unlocking a door that's already there. You're not broken, Silvara. You just need the right key. She stared at him, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. And what would this catalyst do to me? Daniel set the vial down carefully, meeting her gaze with an unusual seriousness. It would give your body what it needs to create life, to do what your people said you couldn't. But I won't lie to you, it's risky. Your biology's more complex than anything I've ever seen. There could be side effects. Silvara's hands tightened around the edge of her robes. The idea of risking her body, her essence, for a chance at redemption filled her with equal parts terror and longing. If this fails, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel interrupted gently. If it fails, nothing changes. You're still you. But if it works, he gestured vaguely toward the firelight, you'll prove them all wrong. For a long moment, Silvara was silent, the only sound the crackle of the fire. Finally, she looked up, her glowing eyes filled with a fragile determination. Do it. The makeshift lab was nothing more than a small clearing in the rocky terrain, lit by the faint glow of Daniel's equipment. Silvara lay on a flat slab of stone, her glowing skin shimmering faintly as the serum Daniel had synthesized coursed through her veins. The process was anything but gentle. Her body convulsed, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the catalyst began to take effect. Hang in there, Daniel said, his voice calm but strained. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he monitored her vitals, his equipment beeping softly. Your body's adapting. It's fighting back, but it's working. Silvara's vision blurred, her mind a haze of pain and strange sensations. She could feel something shifting inside her, an energy she couldn't quite name. It was as if her very essence was being rewritten, each cell awakening to a new purpose. And then, as suddenly as it began, the pain stopped. Silvara's body fell still, her glow dimming to a faint, pulsing light. Daniel leaned over her, his voice soft. Silvara, can you hear me? Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him, her expression dazed but alive. What happened? Daniel grinned, holding up a small device displaying her genetic readings. Your system's changed. It worked. Your body can now. Well, you can have a child. Silvara's hand trembled as she placed it on her chest, feeling the faint hum of life within her. Tears welled in her eyes as her glow began to intensify, brighter and warmer than it had been in weeks. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you, Daniel. Daniel chuckled, stepping back and wiping his hands on his pants. Don't thank me yet. We've still got to make sure it sticks. But Silvara wasn't listening. For the first time in her life, she felt hope. Not just for herself, but for what her child might mean for her people. And as she looked at Daniel, she realized that hope had come from the most unexpected source. A human, a creature she had once dismissed as primitive, had just given her the chance to defy her king. And her destiny. Silvara stood at the mouth of the makeshift shelter she and Daniel had carved into the rocky landscape. The horizon glowed faintly under the light of the twin moons, but there was something new, a pulsing red streak in the sky, distant but growing brighter. It was unmistakable. Ships, Geron's ships. They've found me, Silvara whispered, her voice tight. Her glowing skin flickered as fear surged through her. Daniel emerged from behind her, wiping grease from his hands after another attempt to reinforce their scavenged equipment. He followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing as the distant lights grew closer. You sure it's them? Silvara nodded, her voice tense. The king doesn't leave loose ends. He knows about the child. Her hand moved instinctively to her abdomen, where the faint hum of new life had begun to stir. And he won't stop until he takes it. Daniel looked at her, his jaw tightening. We're not going to let that happen. Silvara turned to him, her glowing eyes clouded with doubt. You don't understand. Geron forces are relentless. Their weapons, their technology, They're unstoppable. I can't fight them. You don't have to fight them alone, Daniel said, stepping closer. We'll figure something out, but we need to move. Now. The rocky wasteland stretched endlessly before them as Silvara and Daniel sprinted toward the old rebel outpost Daniel had discovered days earlier. It was a relic of a forgotten battle. Its walls scarred by centuries of neglect, but it was the closest thing they had to shelter. As they approached, a faint hum caught Silvara's ears. Another ship closer now. They're almost here, she shouted, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Daniel didn't stop. He darted ahead, prying open the rusted hatch that led into the outpost. Get inside. Go! Silvara hesitated for only a moment before diving into the shelter. Daniel followed, slamming the hatch shut behind them. The interior was cramped and dark, filled with broken consoles and decaying equipment. The air was heavy with the scent of rust and old fuel. What now? Silvara asked, her voice shaking as she leaned against the wall. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He moved to one of the consoles, furiously tapping at its cracked interface. The screen flickered to life, displaying a crude schematic of the outpost defenses. This place still has a few surprises, he said, his tone grim. It's old, but if I can get the turrets online, we might have a shot. Silvara's glow brightened slightly, her fear giving way to a flicker of hope. You can do that. Daniel smirked. I'm human. We're good at making broken things work. The first Huron dropship descended like a predator, its sleek metallic frame gleaming in the moonlight. Silvara peered through a crack in the wall, her heart pounding as she saw the king's elite guard disembark. Towering figures clad in shimmering armor that pulsed with energy. Their leader, a tall, imposing figure with sharp features, raised his hand, signaling the others to fan out. They're here, Silvara said, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel gritted his teeth, slamming his fist against the console as the turret sputtered and sparked. Come on, come on. The outpost shook as the Zirans opened fire, their weapons blasting into the rocky terrain around them. Silvara clutched at her abdomen, the faint hum of the child within her filling her with equal parts fear and determination. They'll breach the walls, she said, turning to Daniel. We can't hold them off. Just a few more seconds, Daniel muttered, his fingers flying over the controls. With a triumphant beep, the console lit up and the outpost's long-dormant turrets whirred to life. Outside, the Zirans froze as the turrets pivoted toward them. The first burst of plasma fire erupted, catching them off guard. 2 guards fell, their armor sparking as they crumpled to the ground. The others scattered, firing back at the automated defenses. It's working, Silvara said, her voice filled with astonishment. For now, Daniel replied, grabbing a makeshift blaster from the table. He handed her a smaller weapon. But they'll overwhelm us soon. If we're going to survive this, we need to be smarter than them. Silvara took the weapon hesitantly, her hands trembling. She had never held one before. Her people had always relied on their natural abilities, their glow, their elegance. But now, she had no choice. Stay low, Daniel said, moving toward the hatch. I'll draw their attention. You keep yourself safe, and the baby. Silvara's eyes widened in alarm. You can't face them alone. You'll die. Daniel paused, glancing back at her with a faint smile. Maybe, but I'd rather die fighting for something that matters. Before she could stop him, he slipped through the hatch, disappearing into the chaos outside. The battle was chaos. Daniel darted between the rocks, firing at the advancing Zirans while the turrets provided cover. The Zirans were relentless, their energy weapons scorching the ground around him. Silvara watched from the shelter, her hands clenched tightly around the blaster. She couldn't just hide. Not anymore. Summoning every ounce of courage, Silvara stepped out of the shelter, her glow intensifying as she raised the blaster. Her first shot went wide, but it caught the attention of the Zirans. They turned toward her, their weapons rising. "Over here!" she shouted, her voice carrying over the sounds of battle. Her glow grew brighter, blinding them momentarily. She fired again, this time striking one of the guards in the chest. He fell with a sharp cry, and the others hesitated. Daniel saw his chance. He charged forward, throwing a makeshift explosive into their midst. The resulting blast sent the remaining guards sprawling, their armor scorched and smoking. The silence that followed was deafening. Silvara lowered her weapon, her chest heaving as she stared at the fallen guards. Daniel approached her, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. "Not bad," he said, grinning despite the exhaustion in his voice. Silvara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked down at her glowing hands, trembling slightly. "I never thought I could fight." Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did more than fight. You protected your future." Inside the shelter, Silvara sat by the dimly glowing fire, her thoughts racing. The battle had proven one thing: she wasn't powerless. She had always believed her glow was a mark of beauty, a symbol of status. But tonight it had been a weapon, a beacon of defiance. "They'll come again," Daniel said, sitting across from her. "The king won't stop." Silvara nodded, her gaze steady. "Then we'll be ready." For the first time, her glow shone brightly, unwavering. The wasteland lay silent under the twin moons, the air heavy with the lingering scent of scorched rock and metal. Silvara sat near the dying embers of their campfire, her glowing skin now steady and bright, a stark contrast to the weary, flickering light it had once been. Around her, the faint hum of new life stirred within her, a constant reminder of what she was fighting for. Daniel sat across from her, tinkering with a damaged piece of equipment scavenged from the Juran soldiers. His face was streaked with dirt, his movements slower now, but his resolve had not faltered. They both knew the battle wasn't over. The king wouldn't stop, not after what had happened. Silvara's voice broke the silence. "They'll come again, and next time, the king won't send just soldiers. He'll come himself." Daniel looked up from his work, his eyes meeting hers. "Then we'll be ready." She shook her head, her glowing eyes filled with a mix of determination and fear. "No, we can't keep running, Daniel. We can't keep hiding. If we want to stop him, we need to face him." Daniel frowned, setting down the piece of equipment. "Face him? You mean go to him? That's suicide, Silvara. You saw what just a handful of his soldiers could do. And yet we survived," she replied, her voice steady. She rose to her feet, her glowing skin casting faint light across the rocky terrain. "Because of you. Because of us. He sees me as weak, as broken. But I am no longer the queen he cast aside." Her glow brightened, her resolve sharpening. "I am something more." The next few days were a blur of preparation. Daniel worked tirelessly, using the remnants of Juran technology and his own ingenuity to construct makeshift weapons and fortifications. Silvara, once hesitant, now trained herself to fight, her glowing body moving with newfound strength and purpose. During the quiet moments, they spoke of what lay ahead. Silvara told Daniel of the king's palace, a fortress of obsidian and light, impenetrable to most. Daniel told her of humanity's resilience, of how even the smallest spark of defiance could topple giants. As the final day of preparation came, Silvara placed a hand on her abdomen, feeling the faint hum of the child within her. "This child," she said softly, "is more than a life. It is a symbol of what we can become, Juran and human." Together, Daniel nodded, his expression solemn. "Then let's make sure they get to see that future." The Juran palace loomed in the distance, its spires piercing the heavens like jagged blades. Silvara and Daniel stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking the fortress, their plans set in motion. Daniel had rigged an old Juran transport with explosives, a decoy designed to draw the king's forces away from the palace. It was dangerous, reckless, but it was the only way. "I'll take the transport," Daniel said, fastening the controls. Once I've pulled most of them away, you'll have a clear path. Silvara stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. You're risking too much, Daniel. If you don't make it... He cut her off with a faint smile. You're the one who's important here. You and the kid. If this works, you'll have your chance to finish this. Silvara hesitated, her glowing skin flickering slightly. Then, with quiet resolve, she leaned forward, her forehead resting gently against his. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Daniel smiled, his voice low. Go show him what you're made of. The transport roared to life, streaking across the wasteland toward the palace. As Daniel had planned, Geron's ships immediately swarmed to intercept it, their attention drawn away from Silvara. She waited, her glowing body a faint beacon against the night, until the skies cleared. Then she moved. Silvara slipped into the palace through a forgotten tunnel, her movements swift and silent. The corridors were eerily familiar, a haunting reminder of the life she had left behind. But she was no longer the queen who had knelt before the king's throne. She was something else now. When she reached the throne room, the king was waiting. Vardok stood tall, his armor gleaming with the pulsing energy of the Geron Empire. His expression was one of calculated calm, though his eyes burned with thinly veiled rage. You've returned, he said, his voice cold. I knew you couldn't stay away. Silvara stepped forward, her glow brightening with every step. I didn't return for you, Vardok. I returned to end this. The king laughed a hollow, mocking sound. End this? You are nothing without me, Silvara. You always were. Her glow flared, filling the room with light. You're wrong. You made me believe I was nothing, but now I see the truth. Vardok's expression darkened as he drew his weapon, an elegant staff crackling with energy. You've sealed your fate, Silvara. Whatever strength you think you've found, it will not save you. The battle was fierce, their powers clashing in bursts of light and energy. Vardok fought with the precision of a warrior, his strikes calculated and deadly. But Silvara was no longer fighting for herself. She was fighting for her child, for the future. Her glow intensified, blinding the king as she unleashed the full force of her power. The energy erupted from her, consuming the throne room in a radiant explosion. When the light faded, Vardok lay defeated, his armor shattered, his reign ended. Silvara stood over him, her glowing body steady and unbroken. Your time is over, Vardok. And so is the empire you built on fear. Weeks later, Silvara stood on a cliff overlooking the wasteland, the winds carrying the scent of renewal. Beside her, the rebels who had risen against the king began to rebuild, their strength bolstered by her defiance. Daniel's sacrifice had not been in vain. The decoy had worked, and though she still felt the ache of his absence, she carried his legacy within her. As the first rays of the twin suns rose over the horizon, Silvara placed a hand on her abdomen, where a child stirred with life. You will see a world where we are free, she whispered. A world where we are stronger together. Her glow brightened, reflecting the dawn as she turned to face the future, a queen reborn, carrying the light of hope into a new era.